Sarah Martinez never talked about her military service. The petite woman with kind brown eyes worked quietly as a nurse at Denver General Hospital, treating patients with gentle care and soft words. Her colleagues knew little about her past, only that she had served in the military before becoming a nurse. They saw her as the sweet, quiet woman who always volunteered for extra shifts and never complained about difficult patients. What they didn't know was that Sarah had spent 8 years as a Navy SEAL, one of only a handful of women to ever complete the grueling training program. She had served 3 tours in Afghanistan, leading rescue missions behind enemy lines and training local forces. Her small frame had fooled many enemies who underestimated her until it was too late. But those days were behind her now. Sarah had hung up her combat boots for scrubs, trading her rifle for a stethoscope. The transition to civilian life hadn't been easy. The hospital's sterile hallways felt strange after years in dusty compounds and military bases. The biggest challenges she faced now were cranky patients and long shifts, a far cry from life-or-death combat situations. Sarah found peace in helping people heal instead of fighting wars. She had deliberately chosen a quiet life, hoping to leave the violence of her past behind. On this particular Tuesday evening, Sarah was finishing her shift in the emergency room. It had been a typical day filled with minor injuries, flu cases, and the usual stream of patients that kept the ER busy. She was looking forward to going home to her small apartment, maybe ordering some takeout and watching a movie. Her routine was simple and predictable, exactly how she liked it now. As she gathered her things from her locker, Sarah heard raised voices coming from the waiting area. This wasn't unusual in an emergency room, where stress and pain often made people short-tempered. She had learned to tune out most disturbances, but something about these voices made her pause. There was an edge to them that triggered old instincts she thought she had buried. Sarah walked toward the waiting area to investigate. The night shift nurse, Jennifer, was behind the reception desk looking increasingly uncomfortable. Standing in front of the desk were 3 men who appeared to be in their 20s. They were dressed in expensive clothes and had the cocky attitude that came with money and privilege. Their voices carried the slight slur of people who had been drinking. The tallest of the 3, a blond man with a designer watch, was leaning over the reception desk, getting uncomfortably close to Jennifer. His 2 friends flanked him, creating an intimidating presence that made other patients in the waiting area shift nervously in their seats. Sarah could see that Jennifer was trying to remain professional, but her hands were shaking slightly as she attempted to explain hospital policies. "Look, lady, I don't think you understand who we are," the blond man was saying, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "My father owns half the buildings in this city. I'm not sitting in this waiting room with these people for some stupid forms. Get us a room now, or I'll make sure you're looking for a new job tomorrow." Jennifer's voice was steady, but Sarah could hear the strain in it. "Sir, I understand you're frustrated, but everyone has to follow the same procedures. The doctor will see your friend as soon as possible. But there are patients ahead of you who arrived first. If this is truly an emergency, we can—" "Don't tell me what's an emergency." The man slammed his hand on the desk, making Jennifer jump back. "Do you know what emergency is? It's what's going to happen to this pathetic hospital when my father hears about this treatment. You're going to be lucky if you can get a job cleaning toilets when I'm done with you." Sarah watched as other patients looked away, clearly uncomfortable but unwilling to get involved. Security was probably making rounds somewhere else in the hospital. The 3 men had obviously been drinking heavily, and their friend appeared to have injured his hand, probably in a bar fight. It was the kind of situation that could escalate quickly if not handled properly. The second man, shorter but stockier than his friend, stepped closer to the desk. "You heard him, nurse. We're not waiting around with these losers. Get us a room now, or things are going to get real unpleasant real fast." He gestured dismissively at the other patients, including an elderly man holding his chest and a mother with a sick child. Jennifer tried again, her voice now clearly shaking. "I'm going to have to ask you to lower your voices and return to your seats. If you continue to be disruptive, I'll have to call security." Her attempt at authority only seemed to amuse the 3 men, who exchanged glances and laughed. "Security?" The blond man laughed. "You mean that old fat guy who was sleeping by the door when we came in? I'm shaking in my boots." He turned to his friends and they all laughed louder, enjoying their audience of intimidated patients and one frightened nurse. Sarah felt something stirring inside her that she had worked hard to suppress. It was the same feeling she used to get when she saw bullies picking on the weak, the same instinct that had driven her to join the military in the first place. She had spent years learning to control these impulses, to choose peace over conflict, but watching these privileged boys terrorize a hard-working nurse was pushing all the wrong buttons. The third man, who had been quiet until now, suddenly reached across the desk and grabbed Jennifer's wrist. "Maybe you didn't hear us clearly," he said with a sinister smile. "Let me speak slower so your little brain can understand. We want a room now, or we're going to make your night very, very unpleasant." Jennifer tried to pull her wrist away, but his grip was too strong. The fear in her eyes was clear now, and other patients began to look genuinely alarmed. One elderly woman clutched her purse tighter and moved to a seat farther away. The mother with the sick child stood up, clearly considering leaving despite her child's condition. That was the moment Sarah Martinez decided her quiet civilian life would have to wait. She had sworn an oath long ago to protect those who couldn't protect themselves, and that oath didn't come with an expiration date. Some habits from her SEAL days were too deeply ingrained to ignore, especially when she was watching innocent people being threatened by cowards who thought money made them untouchable. Sarah set down her bag and began walking toward the reception desk. Her movements were calm and controlled, but anyone who knew what to look for would have noticed the subtle change in her posture. The soft-spoken nurse was gone, replaced by something much more dangerous. The three men were about to learn a lesson they would never forget. Sarah approached the reception desk with the quiet confidence of someone who had faced far worse situations than 3 drunk bullies. Her years of military training had taught her to assess threats quickly and respond appropriately. These men were loud, aggressive, and clearly used to getting their way through intimidation, but they had no idea what real danger looked like. "Excuse me," Sarah said in a calm, clear voice as she stepped beside the reception desk. Her tone was polite, but carried an undertone that made all 3 men turn to look at her. Jennifer, still trapped by the third man's grip on her wrist, looked at Sarah with a mixture of relief and concern. The blonde leader looked Sarah up and down dismissively. She was barely 5 feet 4 inches tall and probably weighed less than 130 pounds. In her scrubs and with her long, dark hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, she looked like exactly what she was supposed to be, a harmless hospital worker finishing her shift. "This doesn't concern you, sweetheart," the blonde man said with a condescending smile. "Why don't you run along and let the adults handle this situation?" His friends chuckled at his comment, clearly enjoying having another target for their amusement. Sarah maintained her calm expression as she addressed the man holding Jennifer's wrist. "I'm going to need you to let go of her hand right now." Her voice remained steady and polite, but there was something in her eyes that should have warned them. It was the look of someone who had stared down armed terrorists and lived to tell about it. The stocky man stepped closer to Sarah, trying to use his size to intimidate her. "Or what, little nurse? You going to call the cops? By the time they get here, we'll be long gone. And your friend here will have learned some manners." What happened next took less than 3 seconds, but it would be replayed in the minds of everyone who witnessed it for years to come. The man holding Jennifer's wrist made the mistake of raising his free hand toward Sarah's face, apparently planning to push her away or perhaps even strike her. Sarah's response was instantaneous and devastating. Her left hand shot out and grabbed his wrist in a grip that immediately cut off circulation to his fingers. At the same time, her right hand struck a pressure point on his forearm with surgical precision. The combination of pain and nerve disruption caused his hand to release Jennifer immediately, as he cried out in shock. Before he could even process what had happened, Sarah had stepped behind him and applied a sleeper hold that any MMA fighter would have recognized. But this wasn't a sporting technique. This was a combat application designed to end threats quickly and permanently. The man's eyes rolled back and he collapsed to the floor, unconscious but breathing. The entire sequence happened so fast that his 2 friends were still processing the first move when their companion hit the ground. The waiting room, which had been filled with nervous chatter, fell completely silent. Even the background noise of the hospital seemed to fade as everyone stared at the small nurse, who had just neutralized a man twice her size without breaking a sweat. The blonde leader's expression changed from amusement to confusion, to anger in rapid succession. "What the hell did you just do?" he shouted, his voice cracking slightly. The confidence he had shown when bullying Jennifer was evaporating quickly as he realized this situation had just become very unpredictable. Sarah stood over the unconscious, man and looked up at the remaining two with the same calm expression she had worn throughout the encounter. "He'll be fine in a few minutes," she said matter-of-factly. "He's just taking a little nap. Now, I believe someone asked you to lower your voices and return to your seats." The stocky friend looked down at his unconscious companion and then back at Sarah with growing alarm. "You can't just attack people like that. That's assault. I'm calling the police right now." He fumbled for his phone with shaking hands, his earlier bravado completely gone. "Please do," Sarah replied calmly. "I'm sure they'll be very interested in hearing about 3 intoxicated men who came into a hospital and physically threatened the staff. Jennifer, are you okay? Did he hurt your wrist?" She turned to check on the nurse, keeping one eye on the 2 remaining men. Jennifer rubbed her wrist where the man had grabbed her, but she was staring at Sarah with amazement. "I'm fine, but where did you learn to do that?" She had worked with Sarah for 2 years and had never seen even a hint that the quiet nurse possessed such skills. The blonde man was clearly struggling to process what he had just witnessed. His friend wasn't some weakling. He was a former college football player who worked out regularly and had never lost a fight in his life. Yet this tiny nurse had put him down like he was a child having a tantrum. "Look, lady, I don't know what kind of martial arts stuff, you know. But you just made a big mistake," he said, though his voice lacked the conviction it had carried earlier. "My father has lawyers who eat people like you for breakfast. You're going to pay for this big time." Sarah listened to his threats with the patience of someone who had heard similar bluster from much more dangerous people. Taliban fighters had promised to do terrible things to her and her teammates. Warlords had sworn vengeance against her unit. Compared to threats from people with actual weapons and the will to use them, the angry words of a privileged college boy carried about as much weight as a feather. "Your friend should be waking up soon," she said, ignoring his legal threats entirely. "When he does, I suggest all 3 of you find somewhere else to get medical attention. There are several other hospitals in the city that might be more suited to your particular needs." The unconscious man began to stir, making confused noises as consciousness slowly returned. His friends knelt beside him, trying to help him sit up while shooting nervous glances at Sarah. The entire dynamic in the waiting room had shifted completely. The patients who had been cowering in fear were now watching with fascination and barely concealed satisfaction. An elderly man who had been holding his chest earlier actually smiled and gave Sarah a subtle thumbs up. The mother with the sick child moved her chair closer to the reception desk, apparently feeling safer near the small nurse than farther away. Even other hospital staff members had begun to gather, drawn by the commotion but staying at a respectful distance. "What happened?" The recently unconscious man mumbled as his friends helped him to his feet. He looked around in confusion, clearly having no memory of the past few minutes. His hand went to his throat, which was probably sore but showed no visible signs of injury. "You had a little accident," the blonde leader said quickly, not wanting to admit that their friend had been taken down by someone who looked like she should be serving them coffee, rather than demonstrating advanced combat techniques. "We need to get you checked out. Let's go to Presbyterian Hospital instead." As the 3 men prepared to leave, with the formerly unconscious one leaning heavily on his friends, Sarah picked up her bag and prepared to finally head home. She had hoped to avoid any situation that would require her to use her military training, but some things were more important than maintaining her peaceful civilian facade. The waiting room began to buzz with excited conversation as patients and staff processed what they had just witnessed. Jennifer was still staring at Sarah with a mixture of gratitude and amazement, clearly wanting to ask questions but not sure where to begin. The 3 men stumbled toward the exit, but the blonde leader couldn't let it go. His entire identity was built around being in control, around having power over others through his family's wealth and influence. What had just happened challenged everything he believed about his place in the world. A nobody nurse had humiliated him in front of witnesses, and that was unacceptable. Just as they reached the automatic doors, he turned back toward Sarah with fury burning in his eyes. "This isn't over," he called out loud enough for everyone to hear. "Nobody embarrasses the Harrison family and gets away with it. I'll destroy your pathetic little career and make sure you never work in this city again." Sarah paused and turned to face him directly. For the first time since the encounter began, her expression changed slightly. The polite mask slipped just enough to reveal something that made several people in the waiting room take an involuntary step back. It was the look of a predator who had been pushed beyond patience. "What's your full name?" she asked in a voice that was still calm but carried undertones that suggested her previous restraint had been a choice, not a limitation. The question caught him off guard. "What? Your name?" Sarah repeated slowly. "You mentioned the Harrison family. I want to make sure I have the correct spelling when I file my report." Confusion flickered across his face. "Report? What report?" "You attacked my friend." Sarah pulled out her phone and opened the camera app. "For the record, could you state your full name and your father's name? I want to make sure the authorities have all the correct information when they review the security footage of you physically assaulting a hospital employee." The confidence that had been building in his voice faltered. "Security footage?" "Oh yes," Sarah said, gesturing casually toward the corners of the waiting room where security cameras were clearly visible. "Every hospital has extensive security systems. I'm sure the footage shows your friend grabbing Jennifer's wrist quite clearly, along with your threats against the hospital staff. And of course, my response was purely defensive." The man's face began to pale as the implication sank in. His friends were looking increasingly nervous, obviously realizing that their wealthy families might not appreciate being dragged into a legal situation that would be very difficult to explain away. Jennifer, emboldened by Sarah's support, stepped forward. "That's right. I'll be filing a formal complaint first thing in the morning. Physical assault against healthcare workers is a felony in this state, and threatening hospital employees is taken very seriously by the district attorney's office." The stocky friend grabbed the blonde man's arm. "Dude, we need to leave now. This is getting way out of hand." His earlier bravado had completely evaporated as he realized they had stumbled into a situation that could have serious legal consequences, but the blonde leader wasn't ready to back down completely. His pride had taken too big a hit to walk away without some kind of face-saving gesture. "You think you're so tough?" he snarled at Sarah. "You caught us by surprise, that's all. In a fair fight, you wouldn't last 30 seconds. Sarah considered his challenge for a moment. Around the waiting room, she could see patients and staff watching with fascination. The elderly man who had given her a thumbs up earlier was now openly grinning. A security guard had finally appeared and was approaching cautiously, clearly trying to assess the situation. "A fair fight," Sarah repeated thoughtfully. "Interesting concept. When you and your friends were threatening Jennifer, was that a fair fight? 3 grown men against 1 nurse doing her job? That's different," he said defensively. "We weren't looking for a fight. We just wanted service." By grabbing her wrist and making threats, Sarah's voice remained level, but her eyes never left his face. "Tell me, what exactly do you think constitutes a fair fight? Because I've seen a lot of different definitions over the years." The man seemed to realize he was digging himself deeper into a hole, but his anger and embarrassment drove him to continue. "Look, I don't know what kind of karate movies you've been watching, but real life isn't like that. You got lucky once. That doesn't make you some kind of action hero." Sarah nodded thoughtfully. "You're absolutely right. Real life isn't like the movies." She paused and looked around the waiting room at all the people watching. In the movies, the bad guys usually get multiple chances to change their behavior. They get warnings and second chances and dramatic speeches about redemption. She took a step closer to him, and despite being nearly a foot shorter, somehow managed to make him look small. But in real life, bullies who threaten innocent people don't usually get second chances. They get exactly what they deserve, exactly when they deserve it. The security guard finally reached them, a large man in his 50s who looked like he had probably seen everything during his years working hospital security. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, though his tone suggested he had already figured out which side he was on. "These gentlemen were just leaving, Frank," Jennifer said quickly. "They came in intoxicated and became aggressive when asked to follow standard procedures." Sarah helped de-escalate the situation. Frank looked at the 3 young men taking in their expensive clothes, their obvious intoxication, and their defensive postures. Then he looked at Sarah, who appeared completely calm and collected despite having just been involved in a physical altercation. "That right?" Frank asked Sarah. "These boys giving you trouble?" "Nothing I couldn't handle," Sarah replied simply, "though I think they might be more comfortable seeking medical attention elsewhere." The unconscious man had fully recovered by now and was looking around in confusion, trying to piece together what had happened. His friends quickly filled him in with a version of events that made them sound like victims of an unprovoked attack. Frank listened to their complaints with the expression of someone who had heard similar stories countless times before. And this unprovoked attack happened after you did what exactly? The blonde leader tried to regain control of the narrative. We were just asking for normal service. We have a medical emergency, and they were making us wait with everyone else like we're nobody. When we tried to explain the situation, she attacked my friend for no reason. For no reason, Frank repeated slowly. He looked at Jennifer, who was still rubbing her wrist. That right, Jennifer? They were just explaining the situation. One of them grabbed my wrist and threatened me, Jennifer said firmly. They were loud, abusive, and clearly intoxicated. Sarah stepped in when the situation escalated to physical contact. Frank nodded and turned back to the three men. Gentlemen, I think it's time for you to leave. You can seek medical attention at any of the other hospitals in the city. If you choose to remain on hospital property, I'll be calling the police to have you removed for trespassing and assault. The blonde man started to object, but his friends were already pulling him toward the door. They had sobered up enough to realize that continuing this confrontation was only going to make things worse for them. As they finally left, the man turned back one last time. This isn't over, he said, pointing at Sarah. You have no idea who you're messing with. Sarah watched them disappear through the automatic doors before turning back to gather her things. The waiting room gradually returned to its normal quiet hum of conversation, though she could feel eyes on her as people whispered about what they had just witnessed. Frank approached her with obvious curiosity. Where exactly did you learn to do that, Sarah? I've been working security for 20 years, and I've never seen anyone handle a situation quite like that. Sarah shouldered her bag and smiled politely. Just picked up a few things over the years, Frank, nothing special. She turned to Jennifer. Are you okay? Do you need me to stay and help with any paperwork? Jennifer shook her head, still looking at Sarah with amazement. I'm fine, thanks to you. But seriously, where did you learn those moves? That was incredible. Just some self-defense classes, Sarah said vaguely. I should get going. It's been a long day. She headed toward the exit, hoping to finally make it home and put this incident behind her. But as she walked toward the parking garage, Sarah had a feeling that her quiet civilian life was about to become much more complicated. 3 days later, Sarah was working the morning shift when Jennifer approached her with a concerned expression. Sarah, there's someone here to see you. Says he's from hospital administration. Jennifer's voice carried a worried tone that immediately put Sarah on alert. Sarah followed Jennifer to the small conference room where a well-dressed man in his 50s was waiting. He stood up when she entered, extending a manicured hand that spoke of someone who had never done manual labor. His expensive suit and gold watch marked him as someone with serious money and the attitude that usually came with it. Miss Martinez, I'm Richard Harrison. I believe you had an encounter with my son Bradley the other night. His voice was controlled and polite, but Sarah could hear the underlying steel. This was a man used to getting his way through a combination of wealth, influence, and carefully applied pressure. Sarah shook his hand and took a seat across from him, maintaining the same calm demeanor she had shown during the original incident. Mr. Harrison, how can I help you? Harrison studied her for a moment, clearly trying to reconcile his son's description of events with the small, soft-spoken woman sitting across from him. My son tells me there was some kind of misunderstanding the other night. He says you physically attacked his friend without provocation. That's an interesting version of events, Sarah replied calmly. Is that why you're here? To discuss your son's interpretation of what happened? Harrison leaned back in his chair, his expression becoming more calculating. I'm here because my family has significant investments in this hospital. We've donated millions of dollars over the years, and we expect a certain level of service and respect when we need medical care. Sarah waited for him to continue, recognizing the setup for what it was. This was a man who was used to using his wealth as a weapon, applying financial pressure to get what he wanted. She had dealt with similar tactics from corrupt officials and warlords overseas, though they usually had guns instead of checkbooks. I've spoken with the hospital board, Harrison continued. They're very concerned about this incident. It seems there might be questions about your fitness to continue working here, given your apparent tendency toward violence. I see, Sarah said simply. And what exactly are you proposing? Harrison smiled, but it was the cold expression of a predator who thought he had cornered his prey. I'm a reasonable man, Miss Martinez. I understand that sometimes good people make bad decisions in stressful situations. If you were to apologize to my son and his friends and perhaps consider finding employment elsewhere, I think we could put this whole unfortunate incident behind us." Sarah considered his offer for a moment. It was exactly what she had expected. Men like Harrison always believed that everyone had a price, that the right combination of threats and incentives could make any problem disappear. What he didn't understand was that he was dealing with someone who had faced far worse consequences than losing a job. "That's very generous of you, Mr. Harrison," Sarah said finally. "But I'm curious about something. Did your son mention what exactly led up to the incident? The part where his friend physically grabbed a nurse and made threats against hospital staff?" Harrison's expression didn't change, but Sarah caught a flicker of something in his eyes. He wasn't surprised by this information, which meant his son had told him the truth about what happened. He just didn't care. Young men sometimes get carried away when they're worried about their friends, Harrison said dismissively. "I'm sure no real harm was intended. The important thing is how we move forward from here." "The important thing," Sarah repeated slowly, "is that your son and his friends came into this hospital drunk, threatened the staff, and physically assaulted a nurse. The fact that they're wealthy doesn't change the fact that they committed crimes." Harrison's mask of politeness began to slip slightly. "Now see here, Miss Martinez, you're in no position to make accusations. My son is a good boy from a good family. You're a nobody nurse with a history of violence. Who do you think people are going to believe?" Sarah smiled for the first time since he had entered the room. It wasn't a warm expression. "That's an interesting assumption, Mr. Harrison. What makes you think I'm a nobody?" Something in her tone made Harrison pause. For just a moment, he saw something in her eyes that reminded him of other dangerous people he had encountered in his business dealings. Men who smiled while they calculated exactly how much damage they could do if pushed too far. "I've done my research on you," Harrison said, though with slightly less confidence than before. "You're a nurse who worked at a couple of other hospitals before coming here. No family money, no important connections. You're exactly the kind of person who disappears when powerful people want them to disappear." Sarah nodded thoughtfully. "Your research is interesting but incomplete. Tell me, did your investigation turn up anything about my military service?" Harrison waved his hand dismissively. "Some kind of army medic training, I assume. That's how you learned your little self-defense tricks. But that doesn't change anything about your current situation." "Army medic?" Sarah repeated with genuine amusement. "That's what your research told you?" For the first time since he had entered the room, Harrison looked uncertain. There was something about Sarah's reaction that suggested his information might not be as complete as he had thought. Sarah pulled out her phone and scrolled through her contacts until she found the number she was looking for. "Mr. Harrison, I think you might benefit from speaking with someone who can provide you with more accurate information about my background." She dialed the number and put the phone on speaker. After 2 rings, a gruff voice answered. "Martinez, how the hell are you, warrior?" "I'm fine, Chief. I have someone here who would like to learn more about my military service. Would you mind sharing a few details about my background?" There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Who am I talking to?" Sarah looked directly at Harrison. "This is Richard Harrison. His son had an encounter with me a few nights ago, and Mr. Harrison seems to think I was an Army medic." The laughter that erupted from the phone speaker was loud enough to make Harrison jump. "Army medic. That's a good one. Martinez, you want to tell him or should I?" "Why don't you give him the highlights, Chief?" The voice on the phone became more serious. "Mr. Harrison, Sarah Martinez served 8 years as a Navy SEAL. She completed 3 combat tours in Afghanistan, led 17 successful rescue missions behind enemy lines, and received 2 Bronze Stars and a Purple Heart. She's one of the most decorated female special operations soldiers in military history." Harrison's face had gone completely white. He stared at Sarah as if seeing her for the first time, finally understanding that he had drastically underestimated exactly who he was dealing with. The voice on the phone continued. "She could have killed your son's friend instead of just putting him to sleep for a few minutes. The fact that she showed that level of restraint tells me she's adapted better to civilian life than most of us do. Mr. Harrison, if I were you, I'd count my blessings and walk away from this situation while I still could." Sarah ended the call and looked at Harrison, who was still processing what he had just heard. "So, Mr. Harrison, now that you have more accurate information about my background, would you like to revise your offer?" Harrison sat in stunned silence for several long moments. His entire strategy had been based on the assumption that he was dealing with a powerless civilian who could be easily intimidated or bought off. Learning that Sarah was a decorated special operations veteran changed everything about the dynamic of their conversation. "I think," he said finally, his voice much quieter than before, "that perhaps we should all just put this incident behind us and move on." Sarah nodded. "I think that's a wise decision, Mr. Harrison. And perhaps you might want to have a conversation with your son about appropriate behavior in public places, especially places where people are trying to help others." Harrison stood up quickly, clearly eager to leave. "Yes, well, I'll certainly discuss that with Bradley. Thank you for your time, Miss Martinez." After he left, Sarah sat alone in the conference room for a few minutes, knowing that word about her military background would spread quickly through the hospital. Her quiet civilian life was officially over. But maybe that wasn't entirely a bad thing. Within hours of Richard Harrison's visit, word about Sarah's military background had spread throughout Denver General Hospital like wildfire. Nurses whispered in break rooms. Doctors discussed it between patient visits, and support staff shared the story with anyone who would listen. The quiet nurse who had worked among them for 2 years was suddenly revealed to be a decorated war hero. Dr. Patricia Chen, the emergency department chief, called Sarah into her office that afternoon. Dr. Chen was a no-nonsense woman in her 40s who had earned respect through competence and fairness rather than politics or intimidation. She had always appreciated Sarah's calm professionalism, but had never suspected the depth of experience behind it. "Sarah, please sit down," Dr. Chen said, gesturing to the chair across from her desk. "I think we need to have a conversation about recent events." Sarah took a seat, preparing herself for what might be a difficult discussion. Even with Harrison backing down, there could still be administrative complications from the incident. Hospital lawyers might be concerned about liability, or the board might worry about negative publicity. "First," Dr. Chen continued, "I want to thank you for protecting Jennifer the other night. What those men did was completely unacceptable, and your intervention probably prevented the situation from becoming much worse." Sarah felt some of the tension in her shoulders ease. "I just did what needed to be done, Dr. Chen. Jennifer was being threatened and someone had to step in." Dr. Chen nodded. "That's exactly the kind of thinking I would expect from someone with your background. Which brings me to why I asked you here. Why didn't you ever mention your military service? That's exactly the kind of experience we value in emergency medicine." Sarah considered her answer carefully. "I wanted to be judged on my nursing skills, not my military record. I was trying to build a quiet civilian life, and I thought my past service wasn't relevant to my work here." "Not relevant?" Dr. Chen looked surprised. "Sarah, you have 8 years of combat medical experience. You've treated trauma cases under fire in some of the most dangerous places on Earth. That kind of experience is incredibly valuable in an emergency room." Over the next hour, Dr. Chen asked detailed questions about Sarah's military service. She wanted to understand the scope of her medical training, her leadership experience, and her ability to function under extreme pressure. As they talked, it became clear that Sarah's background was far more extensive than anyone had realized. "I've been thinking about our staffing needs," Dr. Chen said finally. "We've been looking for someone to head up our new trauma response team. It's a specialized unit that would handle our most critical cases, particularly those involving violence or mass casualty incidents. Would you be interested in being considered for that position?" Sarah was genuinely surprised by the offer. "Dr. Chen, I appreciate the opportunity, but I'm not sure I'm ready for that kind of responsibility. I've been trying to stay away from anything that might trigger my combat instincts." Dr. Chen leaned forward. "Sarah, what you did the other night wasn't about combat instincts. It was about protecting someone who couldn't protect themselves. That's exactly the kind of person we need leading critical care situations." Before Sarah could respond, there was a knock on Dr. Chen's office door. Jennifer peeked in, looking apologetic for the interruption. "Dr. Chen, I'm sorry to bother you, but there's something happening in the parking garage that you both need to know about." Dr. Chen gestured for Jennifer to continue. "What kind of something?" "There are 3 men in expensive cars waiting by Sarah's vehicle. Security thinks they might be the same guys from the other night, but they're not actually on hospital property, so Frank can't do anything about it." Sarah felt a familiar surge of alertness, the same heightened awareness that had kept her alive through multiple combat deployments. "How long have they been there?" "About an hour," Jennifer replied. One of the maintenance guys noticed them when he went to check the parking meters. They're just sitting in their cars watching the entrance to the garage. Dr. Chen looked concerned. Have you called the police? Frank did, but they said since the men aren't on hospital property and haven't actually done anything illegal, there's not much they can do. They suggested having security escort Sarah to her car, but that's about it. Sarah stood up, her mind already shifting into tactical mode. What kind of cars? How many men total? Are they blocking any exits? Jennifer looked surprised by the rapid-fire questions. Two expensive-looking sports cars and an SUV. I think there are at least 5 or 6 men total. They're not blocking the exits, but they're positioned where they can see anyone coming or going. Sarah nodded, processing the information quickly. They're watching patterns, waiting to see when I leave and which route I take. Classic surveillance setup for someone planning an ambush. Dr. Chen and Jennifer exchanged worried glances. Sarah, maybe you should stay here tonight, Dr. Chen suggested. We have sleeping quarters for staff and maybe they'll give up and leave. That's not how this works, Sarah replied calmly. If I hide, they'll just wait longer and bring more people next time. This needs to be resolved now, while the situation is still manageable. She pulled out her phone and dialed the same number she had called during Harrison's visit. Chief, it's Martinez again. I might need some backup. The gruff voice answered immediately. What's the situation, warrior? Sarah quickly explained about the men waiting in the parking garage. It's probably the Harrison kid trying to salvage his reputation, but I'd rather not handle this alone if I can avoid it. There was a pause on the other end. You know what? I've got 4 guys in the area who could use some excitement. Give me your location and sit tight for 20 minutes. After ending the call, Sarah turned to Dr. Chen. I'm going to need to take the rest of the day off. This situation needs to be handled before it escalates further. Dr. Chen nodded reluctantly. Sarah, please be careful. And think about what I said regarding the trauma team position. The offer stands regardless of how this situation resolves. 20 minutes later, Sarah was watching from the hospital's upper floors as 3 unmarked vehicles pulled into the parking garage. She recognized the tactical driving patterns immediately. These were her former teammates, men who had served alongside her in some of the most dangerous places on Earth. Chief Martinez, no relation, despite the shared name, was the first to exit his vehicle. He was a mountain of a man with graying hair and scars that told stories of a long military career. Behind him came 4 other operators, all moving with the precise coordination of a team that had worked together for years. Sarah watched as they approached the expensive cars where Bradley Harrison and his friends were waiting. The confrontation was brief and decisive. Within 5 minutes, all 3 expensive vehicles were leaving the parking garage at high speed, with no sign of their occupants planning to return. Chief Martinez called Sarah's phone. All clear down here, warrior. Want to come down and get a proper debrief? Sarah took the elevator down to the parking garage where her former teammates were waiting with broad grins. It had been 2 years since she had seen any of them, and the reunion was emotional despite their attempts to maintain military bearing. Look at you, Chief Martinez said, pulling her into a bear hug. Playing nurse and taking down rich kids. You always did like the unconventional missions. What did you say to them? Sarah asked, genuinely curious about how they had resolved the situation so quickly. We just had a friendly conversation about the consequences of stalking federal veterans, replied Rodriguez, one of her former squad mates. Turns out the Harrison boy wasn't as tough as he thought when he was facing people who actually knew how to fight back. Peterson, another team member, was examining Sarah's surroundings with professional interest. Nice setup you've got here, Martinez. Quiet civilian life treating patients instead of shooting terrorists. I can respect that. Speaking of which, Chief Martinez said, his expression becoming more serious. You need to know that word about this incident is spreading through military channels. There are people who remember your service record, and they're talking about how a decorated SEAL is working as a nurse in Denver. Sarah felt a chill of apprehension. What kind of people? The kind who might have job offers for someone with your particular skill set, Chief Martinez replied. Government contractors, private security firms, even some 3-letter agencies. Your name is back on some very interesting lists. I'm not interested, Sarah said firmly. I'm done with that life. I just want to help people heal, not hurt them. Chief Martinez nodded understandingly. I figured you'd say that. But Martinez, sometimes the world doesn't let people like us stay retired. Sometimes situations come up that require our specific talents. As they talked, Sarah realized that her carefully constructed civilian life was unraveling faster than she had anticipated. The incident with Harrison's son had been meant to protect an innocent nurse, but it had set in motion events that were drawing her back into a world she had tried to leave behind. "For now," Chief Martinez said, "just keep doing what you're doing. But stay alert and don't hesitate to call if you need us. Once a SEAL, always a SEAL." After her former teammates left, Sarah stood alone in the parking garage contemplating how dramatically her life had changed in just 3 days. She had thought she could leave her warrior past behind, but perhaps some destinies couldn't be escaped so easily. 2 weeks after the parking garage incident, Sarah had settled into a new routine at the hospital. Word of her military background had spread beyond Denver General, and she found herself fielding calls from reporters, military contractors, and even a few Hollywood agents who wanted to option her story. She politely declined all of them, preferring to focus on her nursing duties and the trauma team position Dr. Chen had offered her. The position came with additional responsibilities and better pay, but more importantly, it allowed Sarah to use her combat medical experience to save lives in ways that felt meaningful and constructive. She was training a new team of nurses and paramedics in advanced trauma care, sharing techniques she had learned on battlefields, but adapting them for civilian emergency medicine. On this particular Thursday evening, Sarah was reviewing patient charts when her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. The message was simple but chilling. "We know where you work. We know where you live. This isn't over." Sarah stared at the message for a moment, then deleted it without responding. It was the 5th threatening text she had received since the Harrison incident, all from different numbers but clearly coming from the same source. Bradley Harrison apparently hadn't learned his lesson about picking fights with people more dangerous than himself. 20 minutes later, as Sarah was preparing to leave for the night, Jennifer approached her with a worried expression. "Sarah, there's a man at the front desk asking for you. He says he's your brother, but something seems off about him." Sarah felt her alertness level spike immediately. She didn't have any brothers, and anyone who knew her well enough to claim family relationship would know that. "What does he look like?" "Tall, blonde, expensive suit. He's very insistent about seeing you, and he's getting agitated when we tell him visiting hours are over." Jennifer paused. "He looks kind of like that Harrison guy who was here before but younger." Sarah nodded grimly. Bradley Harrison was apparently escalating his harassment campaign by coming to the hospital personally and lying about their relationship to gain access. It was a stupid move that showed he still didn't understand exactly who he was dealing with. "Call security and have them escort him off the property," Sarah instructed. "If he refuses to leave, call the police and have him arrested for trespassing." Jennifer hurried away to follow Sarah's instructions, but returned a few minutes later looking even more concerned. "Sarah, he's gone." Frank went to the front desk, but the man had already left. Frank checked the parking areas and didn't see him anywhere. Sarah felt a familiar chill of combat awareness. An enemy who approached and then disappeared without accomplishing their stated objective was usually planning something more sophisticated than a simple confrontation. "Did Frank check the security cameras?" "He's reviewing them now," Jennifer replied. "But Sarah, there's something else. Frank found this taped to your car." She handed Sarah a manila envelope with her name written on it in block letters. Inside was a single photograph that made Sarah's blood run cold. It was a picture of her apartment building, taken from across the street with a telephoto lens. Written on the back in the same block letters was a simple message: "Tonight." Sarah's training kicked in immediately. This wasn't random harassment anymore. This was a planned attack on her home. Bradley Harrison had clearly decided that humiliating him once wasn't enough, and now he was planning to escalate the situation to a level that could have serious consequences for everyone involved. She pulled out her phone and called Chief Martinez. "Chief, I need the team again. Harrison's kid is planning something at my apartment tonight." "On our way," Chief Martinez replied without hesitation. "Don't go home until we've cleared the area." Next, Sarah called the Denver Police Department and reported the threatening messages and the photograph. The desk sergeant was initially dismissive until she mentioned her military background and the previous incident at the hospital. Within minutes, she was speaking with Detective Lisa Morrison, who specialized in stalking and harassment cases. "Miss Martinez, based on what you've told me, this situation has escalated beyond simple harassment," Detective Morrison said. The photograph of your building and the threatening messages constitute credible threats. We're sending a patrol unit to your apartment right now. Sarah remained at the hospital while the police and her former teammates coordinated their response. Dr. Chen insisted she wait in the secure administrative offices rather than the public areas, concerned that Harrison might return to the hospital if his plan for her apartment was disrupted. An hour later, Chief Martinez called with an update. We found them, Martinez. 3 cars parked in strategic positions around your building, with at least 6 men total. They had professional surveillance equipment and what looked like weapons. This wasn't some college kids planning a prank. Sarah felt a chill at the implications. Weapons? Baseball bats, tire irons, and at least 1 handgun that we could see. The police are moving in now to make arrests. These idiots actually thought they could ambush a Navy SEAL using tactics that wouldn't work against a mall security guard. 20 minutes later, Detective Morrison called to confirm that 6 men had been arrested outside Sarah's apartment building. Among them was Bradley Harrison, who had apparently recruited friends and hired what appeared to be private security personnel to help him intimidate Sarah. They're all in custody, Detective Morrison reported. We found evidence of planning for what they called a home invasion. Intervention designed to teach you a lesson about respecting your betters. Mr. Harrison apparently believed he could frighten you into leaving town. Sarah shook her head at the sheer stupidity of the plan. Did he really think that 6 men with sports equipment could intimidate someone with my background? Apparently so, Detective Morrison replied. Rich kids sometimes have very distorted ideas about how the real world works. They're used to problems disappearing when Daddy writes a check, so they don't always think through the consequences of their actions. The arrest of Bradley, Harrison, and his accomplices marked the end of what local news outlets would later call the hospital incident. Richard Harrison quietly paid substantial fines and restitution, while his son faced charges for stalking, criminal threatening, and conspiracy to commit assault. But for Sarah, the incident had broader implications than just dealing with one privileged family's revenge fantasies. Word of the attempted home invasion had spread through military and law enforcement networks, confirming her reputation as someone who could handle herself in dangerous situations. The next morning, Dr. Chen called Sarah into her office with news that would change everything once again. Sarah, I just got off the phone with the Federal Emergency Management Agency. They're creating a new rapid response medical team for disaster situations and terrorist incidents. They want someone with your background to help design and lead the program. Sarah listened as Dr. Chen explained the opportunity. It would mean traveling to disaster zones and potentially dangerous situations, but it would also mean using her skills to save lives on a larger scale than she could accomplish working at a single hospital. It's a federal position with excellent benefits and the chance to make a real difference, Dr. Chen continued. But I understand if you want to stay here where life is quieter and more predictable. Sarah looked out the window at the city where she had tried to build a peaceful civilian life. The Harrison incident had shown her that sometimes trouble found people regardless of how hard they tried to avoid it. Maybe the answer wasn't to keep running from her past, but to find a way to use her skills for something positive. Dr. Chen, Sarah said finally, I think it's time for me to stop hiding from who I am. When do they want me to start? The decision would take her far from Denver and back into a world where her military training would be essential rather than something to conceal. But for the first time since leaving the military, Sarah felt like she was moving towards something important rather than running away from her past. 6 months later, Sarah stood in the ruins of a hospital in Haiti that had been damaged by a massive earthquake. Around her, a team of military medics and civilian doctors worked frantically to treat hundreds of injured survivors. The FEMA Rapid Response Program had deployed her team within 18 hours of the disaster, and they had been working nonstop ever since. Martinez, we need you in triage, called Dr. James Wilson, a former Army surgeon who had become Sarah's closest colleague on the response team. We've got a building collapse with multiple critical injuries coming in. Sarah jogged toward the makeshift triage area they had established in the hospital's parking lot. This was exactly the kind of situation her military training had prepared her for. Chaos, limited resources, and life or death decisions that had to be made in seconds. The difference was that now she was saving lives instead of taking them. As she worked to stabilize a young girl with internal injuries, Sarah reflected on how much her life had changed since that night in the Denver emergency room. The Harrison incident had forced her to confront the reality that she couldn't completely separate herself from her military past. But it had also shown her a way to use those skills for something positive. The FEMA position had been everything Dr. Chen had promised and more. Sarah led a team of 30 medical professionals who specialized in responding to disasters, terrorist attacks, and other mass casualty incidents. They had deployed to hurricane zones, earthquake sites, and even a school shooting where her tactical medical training had helped save dozens of lives. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Jennifer back in Denver. "Saw you on the news helping earthquake victims. So proud of you. P.S. Bradley Harrison got 6 months in jail for the stalking charges. His father had to sell one of his companies to pay the legal fees and restitution." Sarah smiled as she read the message. The Harrison family had learned an expensive lesson about the consequences of targeting people who were more dangerous than they appeared. Bradley's arrest and trial had been covered extensively in the local media, serving as a cautionary tale about wealthy kids who thought money could solve any problem. "Team leader Martinez, please report to the command post," came a voice over the radio. Sarah finished stabilizing her patient and handed care over to one of the other doctors before jogging to the temporary command center they had established. Colonel David Torres, the military liaison for their joint operation, was waiting with a serious expression. "Sarah, we just received intelligence about a situation developing in Syria. There's been a chemical weapons attack on a refugee camp, and the State Department is requesting our team for emergency medical response." Sarah felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that came with high-stakes missions. "How many casualties are we looking at?" "Potentially thousands," Colonel Torres replied grimly. "The Syrian government is denying access to international aid organizations, but they've agreed to allow a small medical team under FEMA auspices. It's going to be dangerous, and we can only take a skeleton crew." Sarah nodded, already mentally preparing for what would be one of the most challenging missions of her career. "When do we leave?" "Wheels up in 4 hours. "Sarah, I need to be clear about something. This isn't a normal disaster response. We'll be operating in an active war zone with limited security support. Anyone who goes needs to understand they might not come back." As Sarah prepared for the Syria mission, she thought about the path that had brought her to this moment. The confrontation with Bradley Harrison had seemed like a minor incident at the time, but it had set in motion events that led her back to the kind of work she was truly meant to do. 2 hours later, as she boarded the military transport plane that would take her team to Syria, Sarah received a call that surprised her. It was Richard Harrison, Bradley's father. "Miss Martinez, I hope I'm not disturbing you," he said, his voice much different from their previous conversation. "I wanted to call before you left for your mission." Sarah was puzzled by the call. "Mr. Harrison, how did you know about my mission?" "I've been following your career since our last meeting," he replied. "I make it my business to know about people who have significant impact, and your work with FEMA has been impressive. I also wanted to apologize for my son's behavior and the trouble it caused you." Sarah was genuinely surprised by the apology. "That's not necessary, Mr. Harrison. Your son learned his lesson, and that's what matters." "Actually, it is necessary," Harrison continued. "You see, I've done some thinking about what happened. My son behaved like a spoiled brat because I raised him to believe that money and connections could solve any problem. You taught him and me that there are some people in this world who can't be bought or intimidated." He paused before continuing. "I've made a substantial donation to FEMA's disaster response program in your honor. It's my way of trying to make amends for the trouble my family caused you." Sarah was speechless for a moment. "Mr. Harrison, that's very generous, but it's not necessary." "It's the least I can do," Harrison replied. "What you're doing now, saving lives in disaster zones, that's the kind of work that actually matters. I spent years teaching my son that power and money were the most important things in life. You showed him that courage and service to others are worth more than all the money in the world." After ending the call, Sarah reflected on the unexpected turn the conversation had taken. Sometimes the most unlikely people could learn important lessons from difficult situations. As the plane lifted off, carrying her team toward another dangerous mission, Sarah realized that her path from Navy SEAL to nurse to FEMA responder had been shaped by a series of seemingly random encounters. The night she had stepped in to protect Jennifer from 3 drunk bullies had seemed like a minor incident, but it had led to a career that allowed her to use her military skills to save lives around the world. Dr. Chen had been right that night in her office. Sarah's combat experience wasn't something to hide from, but rather a set of skills that could be used to help people in ways that few others could manage. The Harrison incident had forced her to stop running from her past and start embracing the unique combination of medical training and tactical expertise that made her invaluable in crisis situations. As the plane flew through the night toward Syria, Sarah thought about all the people she would be able to help because she had refused to back down from 3 bullies in a hospital waiting room. Sometimes the most important battles were fought not on foreign battlefields, but in everyday situations where someone had to choose between walking away and standing up for what was right. The small nurse who had quietly worked at Denver General Hospital was gone, replaced by someone who had learned to integrate all aspects of her experience into a life of service that honored both her military training and her desire to heal rather than harm. It had taken a slap from a drunk college student to remind her who she really was. But sometimes the most important lessons came from the most unexpected sources.